August 6, 1945, Hiroshima of Japan was bombed by a weapon unlike any encountered in the world, the atomic bomb. The bomb's name was Little Boy, and like any boy, it had to develop, it had to grow, it had to be born, and it had to be explored in the Manhattan Project. We start the story in the 1920s and 30s. Scientists such as James Chadwick and Enrico Fermi had been studying the possibilities of splitting the nucleus of the uranium atom, possibilities that could release tremendous amounts of energy. Soon, in 1939, suspicions arose that the Nazis were trying to make an atomic bomb of their own. Even Einstein came into the picture, as he implored current President Roosevelt to acknowledge the situation. In a letter written to Roosevelt on August 2, 1939, he states that in the course of the last 4 months, it has been made probable, through the work of Joliet of France, as well as Fermi and Szilard in America, that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. Now it appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. Eventually, Roosevelt established the Advisory Committee on Uranium. While early results were limited, soon about 20 universities were involved. One of those universities was the University of Chicago in its metallurgical laboratory, otherwise known as the Met Lab. Headed by scientists Enrico Fermi and Arthur H. Compton, two of the most important steps in the Manhattan Project occurred here. First, the discovery of plutonium-239, a likely candidate to use for the bombs. Second, and even more importantly, it created the first sustainable fission chain reaction in uranium. The reactor they operated, CP-1, was astonishingly built underneath the grandstands of the abandoned Stagg Field, but nevertheless was a huge step for the country's project. Soon, research was transferred to Los Alamos, New Mexico, and in 1942, U.S. Army General Leslie Groves assumed total power over the project, with scientists such as Oppenheimer coming into the fray. Not long after, in July of 1945, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb occurred in Alamogordo, New Mexico. With newfound power in hand, the U.S. wasted no time in demonstrating it, establishing themselves as a true world power. However, no matter the power, the Manhattan Project still has a shroud of darkness around it, setting forth the question: to what extent did the Manhattan Project inspire fear and division? First and foremost, despite all of the power from the Manhattan Project, the U.S. was not able to escape an underlying sense of suspicion of the other side. In a questioning by the Senate Atomic Energy Committee, Leslie Groves states that he would recommend the manufacture of explosives being continued until sufficient bombs were made. In an interview, Groves effectively depicts his longing for power.
And he said, he says he wanted this project to be turned over to the scientists. He always resented Bush and myself, and because he said that we weren't nuclear physicists, and therefore he was bitterly opposed to our running it, and he was going to be still more to your being in there. which is absolutely true. He is awfully funny. I had the problem of I wanted to get everything I could out of Bigner.
While it can be seen that he simply wanted to provide safety for the country, embedded in his beliefs was a desire to be superior versus other nations and a desire for power. All things that fed into the Cold War itself, and all things that led to division. Along with that, the scientists behind the Manhattan Project faced their own problems. They resented their involvement in the project as they were pushed to military standards, and they resented the fact that Groves himself didn't understand the scientists' morals and values. In an interview, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a chief scientist for the Manhattan Project, explains these feelings.
I think that scientists like to be called in and asked to advise on how to make the Voice of America a better thing. They like to be called in and asked for their counsel. Everybody likes to be treated as though he knew something. I suppose that that when the government behaves badly in a field you're working close to, when decisions that look cowardly or vindictive or short-sighted or mean are made, and that's very close to your area, then you get discouraged, and you may recite George Herbert's poem, I Will Abroad, but I think that's human rather than scientific.
The resentment extended to scientists at MetLab itself as scientists Jeffries and James Franck warned the U.S. of the dangers of atomic warfare. At the end of World War II, they went as far as establishing the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to influence atomic policy. One of their more prominent roles is their position in the battle between Oppenheimer and the government. The government had accused Oppenheimer of being unpatriotic for his voice against developing the H-bomb, but the Bulletin simply denoted that view as contrary to both decency and common sense. Obviously, the scientists faced both inner and external turmoil in their part of the Manhattan Project, contributing to the division the project created. But the crux of the division occurred in the relationships between scientists and government. Take the argument between Oppenheimer and government over the H-bomb, for example. There is clearly division present, but also consider this letter to Oppenheimer that President Roosevelt wrote nearly 10 years earlier. In his letter, he commends and applauds the scientist for his work. But 10 years later, that certainly isn't the case. Over the course of the Manhattan Project, division had set roots between scientists and government, division that must not be overlooked, and division that even extended to the common man. To explain this, we follow the journey of one man, Philip J. Close. Close was a legal officer for the Manhattan Project, and in a letter he wrote, he details his experience at Nagasaki and his involvement, describing how Nagasaki has this morning disappeared from the map, and that he was tired and unhappy and uncomfortable, with no pride in having participated in the bombing. When he came home, he began drinking heavily and died in 1963. A decorated life and important position Philip J. Close had, but a marked and smeared life as well. As a result of the Manhattan Project, horrors unlike any other arose, contributing to the division and sense of guilt that people would have had. In the end, the question of how much division the Manhattan Project provided is clear, and the answer is clearer. It inspired suspicion, resentment, and guilt. And as the country moves forward in the realm of nuclear energy, it is clear that those issues must be addressed. With the Atomic Energy Act, which established the Atomic Energy Commission, and the 1963 Clean Air Act, we've already started. But one thing is clear. The Manhattan Project was immensely important. And as the first bomb was detonated in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a medley of emotions and feelings was released into the air. And it is our job to corral and understand just what they mean for us and for our future.